Does anybody know what this is?
A goose.
No, is it some kind of a crane?
Peacock.
Hannah, very good. You win the prize.
It's a peacock.
It's a peacock.
It's a peahen.
Yeah, peahen. There you go.
A peahen. Very good. So I've got an echo, Aiko.
Yeah, I'll get out.
So I took a friend on a walk yesterday. It's a walk that I took David Pepper on with his bike, and lo and behold, we saw this a peahen. And when we moved into our house, people were glad we moved in because the last owner had peacocks and they make a terrible noise. But apparently they're in the wild, and so there you go. All right, I digress. So we've got a big menu today. I'm going to just dive right in. For Carol, I've put the Timothy Snyder controversy pretty near the top. Off we go. So
with that long, Cabrillo is not on.
What's that?
Cabrillo is not on the list. It's a long list, but we're going to leave him still in San Diego.
Oh yeah. There's no way I'm going to get the Cabrillo. I couldn't help it. You give me feedback if I'm jumping around too much. But I was seduced by first of all the things that have happened in relation to China. So Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, did go to China. And it looks like Blinken is finally going to go to China, but the Chinese apparently are doing something in Cuba that the hawks think we should punish them for. So who knows? But within the last 3 weeks, there's been some pretty wild stuff going on with China. So they buzzed one of our spy planes going over the South China Sea in what our military branded as unprofessional and aggressive. And then 2 weeks ago, there was this Asian security meeting where they try at least once a year to get the heads of militaries to talk to each other. This was in Singapore. It's called the Shangri-La Dialogue for some reason. And this is the Chinese defense minister. 2 weeks ago, he was pretty pugnacious, and there were some very tense exchanges. Then 8 days ago, there was another incident, this one at sea. And it was a close call, a Chinese ship darting in front. So for you sailors out there, you know that, like Tysil, you know that's a no-no. But Lee then came back and kind of toned it down and said war with the United States would be an unbearable disaster. The backstory is this same guy, Lee, was sanctioned by Trump. What for? He was purchasing Russian weapons. This is in 2018. So they were already ramping up 5 years ago for working more closely with Russia. And what was China's response to our sanctioning Lee? They made him the defense minister last March. So they don't cow easily. The other thing I wanted to talk about, it's gotten more news, is the drop in the population. Now, I referred to it when we talked about peak China. And you'll remember that their fertility rate was so low. 1.2 is very low, right? 2.0 is a replacement. Well, they're way, way below replacement. And we know recently they fell below India in total population. They switched from to a 3-child policy from a 1-child policy. But guess what? That hasn't affected anything yet. And there's some thought that this may be irreversible, that the 1-child policy set in train some irreversible stuff. And it seems like the big sticking point is the high cost of having a child. Now, you can argue, was that really the 1-child policy? But a lot of resources went into raising children during that period. Remember, it was 1 kid, 2 parents, and 4 grandparents. So those kids were a little bit spoiled, I guess. And families were forced to put all their eggs in one basket. But why can't China escape from this trap? Some work has been done, interesting, by a Chinese national in Scandinavia, and she talks about the spillover effects from this, and that it set a new standard in society where everybody was compelled to emulate parents with single children, even those that were exempt from it, like minorities. They started having single children so that their kids could compete in the education system. And this is not China alone. Asian countries, Confucian countries, used to competing for national exams, and that goes back 2,000 years. They all invest in expensive education. And Aiko and I saw this in South Korea, but also in Japan, where they have right after school ends, they go to after school cram sessions, right? China's leaders say, gosh, it's one reason people aren't having a lot of kids is they're laying out a lot of money, and one of the big costs is for private tutoring. So they've cracked down on it and made it illegal to stop the arms race between parents so their kids can compete. In addition, in a more positive manner, they've offered payments and benefits if you'll have more than one kid. But that hasn't worked at all. And China's finding it was easier to limit families than to encourage them. And I think this shows, and comes up repeatedly when we talk about the downside of autocracies, the peril of top-down social planning. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. And this is an example. There's another podcast I like very much. I've mentioned it, The Drum Tower, and it covers China and what's going on. And it's a weekly podcast, and they recently covered the anti-LGBT crackdown. And of course, in the context of dropping population, this is misguided because gay couples want kids and family. As we know in this country, having moved along very much in the last 20 years. And so they're actively repressing gays. So this is the other downside of autocracies, is what they can do. And they've stopped LGBT support groups from meeting. Now that's pretty intrusive. And they've stopped all public pride events for China's gay population. There's a paradox, though, that, okay, we've got, so it tells me I can turn this off because it tells me 2 people have raised their hands, but I don't know who's first. It's really pretty here. Who? Somebody had their hand up? 3 3 people have raised their hands, but I can't hear anybody.
Well, I raised mine, John. This is Homer.
Yeah.
Okay, the whole discussion of the difficulties of expanding the number of children per family seems a very middle class, upper middle class problem. We keep hearing about people in rural areas wanting more children to help with the work on the farms. So wouldn't there be an enormous reservoir of people, even in China, who would welcome the chance to have more children, but maybe didn't pay much attention to the one-child policy except through state mandates?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Homer. It may be that somehow this what the researcher calls the layover, that it spreads. It's almost like a contagion, and it's become an ethic in the society as a whole. It spills over. That's the term she uses. And apparently it's spilled over to the rural communities as well, because it's not happening. We think it should. And the Chinese Communist Party think it should, but it's not. So her thing is that it's a new standard, where and it's really the Confucian ideal. You have a kid and you pour all your resources into educating that kid. That's the best answer I can come up with.
So this is Carol. I have a response to Homer's comment, but the reason I'd raised my hand is because I wondered if anybody else had heard that women are really happy with the one-child policy, because there's one female and there aren't very many guys to marry, and so they're in very big demand. It's economics. They can pick and choose where they couldn't before. That was one comment, and the other comment that I have is, I don't know that those children who are in the rural areas that are supposed to stay on the farm and help with the farm work, if they'd be so happy about staying on the farm. So maybe that's part of it also.
Yeah, a good point. And you know, your first point about women just being quite happy with a decreased fertility rate, that's true in Japan as well, isn't it? And there the motivation is just a response to the sexism. That men who go out after work and drink with their work comrades, and they don't come home to their wives and families until late at night. And I think Japanese women are saying enough. So there's that, and that kind of feeds into your first comment. Okay, who else had their hand up?
I do.
Yeah, Jim.
So strange bedfellows. I've been getting literature from a friend who's on the far right about how horrible the Chinese Communist Party is, and how it's bioterrorism, COVID was bioterrorism, et cetera, and yet the religious right seems to be aligned with this anti-gay stuff. You know, all the anti-LGBT legislation in the red states is pretty dominant, you know, and that seems to be what's going on in China. I don't know what the religious right has to do with communism in China, but
well, you can't make connections between everything, and there are things that they're just inconsistent. But for sure, a big part of autocracy is fertility. And Russia has a huge problem as well. And Putin is famously anti-gay. So some of this is probably Xi Jinping and going back between left and right wing, independent of religion completely.
Yeah, but I don't see much connection. Talk about not making too many connections between fertility and the repression of LGBT. I mean, you can make some dotted lines, I guess, but it's not overwhelming from what I see.
Yeah,
mean-
and I don't think I can answer you satisfactorily. I'll just point
Well,
out the
You
original,
rarely do, John, but
the original fascism was.
speaking of repression and fascism, it comes to mind about the sterilization policies the U.S. had in Puerto Rico back in the 20s and 30s. But
Okay, Jim, I can't keep up with these that jump, but so I want to get back to
Can
this
I have a-
line of thought.
I
Yeah,
have a thing. I have a raised hand.
okay.
Do you remember when we were in Xi'an that guide told us that in the farms that the people did not observe the one-child policy? Remember that? The girl in the gray suit that was our guide. She said that. And also the other thing is that government policy has been so that the people who come to the cities to work, they can't bring their kids. They leave their kids at home with their parents on the farm. Now, they're not going to get as good an education so that they can get in and compete with everybody else in the big cities. And so that's a real problem.
Yeah, you need what's called a hoku, right? And
Yes.
this is a traditional license to move.
Yeah.
Because when you move into a city, you're going to use public services and schools and sewers and China's always controlled, pre-communist, just going back to imperial days. Who can move to the city? So yeah, there is that. But it is strange, and I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to a lot of things. That's for sure. But for some reason, China's population is going down, and and I think the majority does live in the city now. I think they passed that milestone a decade ago. So many more people live in the city that live in the rural area, and so they're importing food as a result. I don't think they're self-sustaining when it comes to food, but for some reason the population has plummeted. 1.2 is pretty low. And I just wanted to report, it's a very loose connection, I grant you, but the LBG community is willing to raise kids and to adopt. And we know in China, they have a long history of female infanticide. So who knows if that's playing a role. But I do know for our medical people that China has sonograms everywhere. And early in pregnancy, they do repeated sonograms to look for the penis. And if they don't see one, that for the family, I'm not saying for the government, for the family, that's an indication to go seek an abortion. Some of that's true in India as well, by the way. Okay. Dare I try to move on beyond the suppression of gays?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the paradox, I am going to make a connection here. It's a paradoxical one. Even though there's fewer people, they have big time unemployment, and it's peaking right now. So look at this, 20% unemployment in university graduates. I think this is what this focuses on. So that's not a stable situation. They point out, the Economist does, that university graduates have increased 40%, that this is the best educated cohort of graduates ever. One of the factors could have been COVID, that a lot of students extended their studies. Where otherwise they might have left and blended into the workplace, they extended their studies. And so there's a lot more of them coming out now, competing for the same job as the current graduates are. During COVID, the Ministry of Education, doing another top-down thing, commanded that master students grow by over 20%. So that may be feeding, maybe this is transitory. But right now, it's enough to create an unstable situation, and possibly is affecting the confidence of the entire society. So this is a communist department head, and he's issued a report that this could affect the entire society, and especially it's a problem that's expressed on social media and contributing to the anxiety. You know, the Great China Wall, their social media is quite active there, and the government does pay attention to it. That seems paradoxical to us, but it seems to be true. A lot of these young people are feeling overeducated, and I like this saying, I feel like I'm on a pedestal and I can't get down from it. But like maybe in our country as well, that there are needs maybe for vocational workers, but that doesn't quite fit the Confucian ideal. But maybe high school education would be enough to develop practical skills. We see other examples of this in the West, and Germany in particular has created the most comprehensive vocational track. Xi's other thing is this common prosperity. And he sees, Deng said he didn't care if a capitalist cat was around as long as he caught the mouse. Well, Xi is less tolerant of wealthy capitalists, and China's education has created a lot in the private sector, and we've looked at examples of how some of them have been cut down, like Jack Ma, who has moved to Japan. But the state is consciously trying to boost up state-owned enterprise that they can control, and de-emphasizing private enterprise. So, you know, some of this language is compatible with what Bernie Sanders has to say about inequality. But China expresses it as an aversion to disorderly expansion of capital. And the two areas of the economy that has particularly affected is property, where there's been a lot of speculation, and then in the education sectors, in particular the tutoring that they've just made illegal. They have targeted a lot of tech firms, but there's some exceptions I'll get to in just a second. But on the other hand, they're encouraging local governments who run these these state-owned enterprises. They're all locally owned. They've urged the local governments to recruit as many graduates as their budgets allow for to kind of mop up the unemployment. And so government, the central government is subsidizing internships that these local governments may offer. And the economist's problem is, hey, you're expanding the least efficient part of your economy. The economist's bias is, of course, liberal in the European sense, economics. The hard tech exceptions, and for this, private enterprise in China is alive and well. Anything to do with aerospace, biotech, or electric vehicles, they're accepted and tolerated, and the private enterprise is encouraged in the 5-year plan. So it's not across the board. And the result of all this is the job search. China's youth want to work for the government, for the government. They want to work at these state-owned enterprises. A distant second is foreign financed or domestic private enterprise. So that's my quick and dirty review of China. Took a little bit longer than I thought. And any comments on China? Okay, on we go to Ukraine. And I'm going to cover the dam collapse that we started and talked about last week. And I'm going to look at an interesting historical precedent. And then we'll spend some time on the counteroffensive that is currently unfolding. So you'll remember we looked at this map last week. And this is the Kakhovka Dam and where it blew up. And all the flooding is downstream. The nuclear power plant is much further upstream, and it's shut down, so it doesn't need a lot of water, but it needs some water. So the water level up here is dropping dramatically, while the water level down here is expanding dramatically. Notice the left bank, and by that I mean the east bank. The left bank of a river is when you're going with the current. On the left-hand side is the left bank. That's held by Russia. And upstream, there was another dam, another power project, and I was very confused trying to read the history. But the older power plant and dam was 250 kilometers upstream. And so I'm going to be talking about a dam, a historical dam that was all the way up here. This is from the current busted dam to the old one. It was built in 1932. Guess what? With American help. Stalin decorated Americans for their work in the Soviet Union. By the way, interestingly, the Koch brothers' father was building oil refineries for Stalin in the 20s in Russia. So America helped design and equip what became known as the Lenin Dam. The magic equation was add electrification and you'll get communism. At that time, in 1932, it was the largest dam in the world. 5 huge American turbines, and Americans got the Soviet Union's highest order. Interesting. World War II, guess what? Stalin blew it up as the Nazis attacked from the West to save it from the Nazi bandits in 1941, right around when a lot of us were born. And so it was Stalin's secret police. They didn't give advance notice to anybody. They were pretty ruthless bunch. So it flooded villages all along the Dnieper, and it was called the patriotic destruction. And it obviously ceased electricity far and wide, but it was termed the most gigantic act of sacrificial sabotage in world's history. That's from an English newspaper, The Observer, British newspaper. And so it worked. But remember, sacrificing Ukrainians in 1941 has to be viewed in the context of the Holodomor, which Irene educated us about, Irene's family being from Odessa. And in that, 7 to 10 million died for the sake of either industrialization, or Stalin was suspicious of Ukrainian desire for independence. And Snyder has educated us that independence movement went back almost 100 years. And it was cultural as well as political. So when Stalin blew up the dam, thousands died. Not that many have died yet. We don't know for sure, but it seems to be much less, in the hundreds. Aiko's reading Bloodlands now and emphasizing Snyder's emphasizing of how brutal life was in Eastern Europe. And blowing up of the dam, both sides, military personnel died. In this blowing up of the dam, mostly Russian military personnel. Why? Because the left bank at this part of the river is much lower than the right bank. So the Germans did eventually get across the Dnieper. We know they got all the way to Stalingrad. And then during that time, they partially rebuilt the dam. But when after Stalingrad and a few other battles, I think the Battle of Kharkiv, incidentally, may have been even bigger in some ways, as they were going back across the Dnieper, they blew up the dam that they had built to replace the first dam. And then at the end of the war, the Soviets rebuilt the dam. So I'd like to get into a bit of controversy. I do it reluctantly. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of repeating what I've read and what makes sense to me, but I'm sure open to criticism on this. The question is, was the destruction of the dam deliberate, or alternatively, was it just incompetent maintenance? And I think until we know for sure that this is the default hypothesis, right? Until we have firm proof, right? This is the core principle of science. But it is interesting to speculate who benefits from the dam's collapse. We were faced with a similar case. Remember when the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up? Well, at that, everybody was in the mindset that anything bad that happened, it was Putin. but if taking a pause, who had the most to gain from the blowing of the Nord Stream pipeline? You can make a strong case that it was Ukraine. And in fact, it seems to be the conventional wisdom now that it was the Ukrainians, special operations that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, because they had everything to gain in committing Europe to helping them and not relying on Russia for anything. And this was in the Discord leaks. If any of you have other information and opinions, interrupt me. Okay, so how has Ukraine benefited? And I'll get to that after Homer talks.
Well, I read the person you often quote, Timothy Snyder's analysis of who blew up the dam. He's very, very critical of both sidism of the Western press, as even entertaining the idea that it could have been the Ukrainians. It was absolutely the Russians in his view.
Yeah.
So you might go back to his column on that, because you much admire his analyses.
Thank you for setting the table. Carol and I were talking about this before we started, and I'm getting to that. This is the controversy that I really would like everybody's help on. The Ukrainians could have already benefited by the Russian minefields being destroyed, the Russian military occupation being disrupted. Last week, we talked about the Crimean water supply being disrupted. Why would the Russians blow up their source of water for Crimea? And, it didn't make sense at the very beginning is, well, you're releasing all this water. Why would that disrupt the Crimean water supply? Well, the intake valve for that canal we looked at last week is above the current reduced level now that so much is spilling downstream. Anyway, it's still too early and everybody's still evaluating, but I want to introduce one new source before I get to Timothy Snyder and the controversy that Homer alludes to. The Institute of War. It doesn't sound like a very savory new source of information, but it keeps popping up, and apparently they're doing a pretty good job of analysis. And they've got a pretty good website with a lot of maps for those of us that love maps. And this is the map that they have of the Russian defense fortifications that we've all heard about. This is what the Ukrainians are going to have to get across if they want to get to the Sea of Azov, or they want to get to Crimea, all these red triangles. So you may be seeing maps from this source. I don't plan on every week following that closely. Maybe, I don't know, you tell me, give me some guidance once a month, once every 2 months. I'm into history, and basically I'm trying to summarize the history of the last 2 years here a little bit. The Institute of War, they say that already 12 military settlements have been destroyed, that the Russian lines have been pushed back as far as 10 kilometers, and obviously their first line fortifications have been affected, and the position that they used to shell Kherson City is no longer usable. So Kherson, the city on the other side of the river, not the general region, is spared for now. So there's another incentive for Ukraine. to push the Russians back, flood them out, and get some relief for Kherson City. Anyway, their estimate is that the Russians have lost 375 square kilometers. That's of 4 days ago. So who knows by now? And then this just shows how much above the dam, the water level has dropped from the loss of water from the sprung dam. And it's a little bit like our discussion of Lake Mead. The water level's now below, I think it's below the intake for the Crimean Canal. So already Crimea is having to cope. Okay, now we get to what Homer was talking about and what Carol will be interested in, because she introduced us to Timothy Snyder, and I've been an apostle as well. He is a cheerleader, and I find myself, especially after we do a session on autocracy and the fall of democracy over the last 20 years, and what we can call now the age of the strong man, the last 20 years. He published this article that Homer read, the 10 guidelines for writing about catastrophe. And he's been criticized by Robert Wright. Now, Robert Wright is a guy I follow as well. He is not politically of the right. He's, if anything, politically a lefty. But he is, and when it comes to foreign affairs, very much a realist. And his goal is to avoid nuclear war. And that's his great priority now, which Snyder thinks is that the risk of that is overblown. But Robert Wright specifically, when it comes to this dam, thinks that Snyder has greatly overstated the confidence that we can put that Putin did this. And as Homer quoted Snyder, Snyder said one of his 10 basic rules is you shouldn't both sides this in this calamity where Russia's involved. Of course, Putin committed the crime. But I mean, that's kind of what we thought about the Nord Stream pipeline. And Wright's specific beef with Timothy Snyder, remember now, Robert Wright is a realist, and Timothy Snyder is more ideologically, like me, bent on the survival of democracy. That Robert Wright thinks moral outrage, which we all feel, is risky. And so that makes me stop and pause and at least think, am I too much a cheerleader as well? I don't know. This has gone to Twitter big time. And once you go to Twitter, everything gets hyped up. We know Timothy Snyder has met and gone to Ukraine repeatedly, that he's met with Zelensky, and these are all the books that he's written. Iko's currently reading Bloodlands, and so Robert Wright says that moral outrage should be replaced by cool calculation, a typical realist statement. And we certainly went over that when we looked at John Mearsheimer, who is really channeling Henry Kissinger. But the main concerns are nuclear war, okay, but a wider non-nuclear conflagration that could extend to NATO nations. And And Robert Wright leaves me with a nagging question. If Russia controlled that dam and could control whenever it wanted to flood that area, why would they give up that ace in the hole? And I think probably the answer is going to be that neither, as in terms of official policy, neither Ukraine and Russia did it, but it was a product of irregular action, like Belgorod. Okay, so let's look at what irregular action means. And here I get back to the Telegraph again, that are, I think they're doing excellent work in covering. It's not so much for the day-to-day I'm interested in. I'm interested in the major strands of what's happening there. And irregular action, I'm going to try to give you a history over the last few months of what this regular action is. They have a reporter who has been a tank commander, and so he knows what he's talking about in the British Army. He explains irregular action. He did. They do a weekly YouTube, and he talked about how Zelensky is channeling Churchill to set Russia ablaze. Churchill wanted to set Germany ablaze. And how did he want to do that? Through sabotage, financing local resistance movies, all the heroes that we've seen in World War II movies that we've watched, sabotage. And to understand industrial systems and how they work and where their soft spots are. And so what have we seen over the last 6 months? We've seen oil refineries mysteriously blowing up in Crimea. We've seen these irregulars go across the border into Russia, Belgorod. This maps out their incursions. You notice it's just to the northeast of Kharkiv, just to orient you. Here's Ukraine, Kharkiv to the northeast. So in Russia itself, we've got irregular troops at work. There's two main groups. This group is acceptable. I won't give you names and go into details, but this group is acceptable. This group, not so much. This group may be a little bit like the Azov Brigade. For those that were with us a year ago, we went through the Azov Brigade, and they're very real contact with neo-Nazis. And this group may be like that. So we got a late start, so I'm going to go a little bit over, if that's okay. Not too much, though. And this is the alpha male in this arguably neo-Nazi group. There's alpha males everywhere. So what else? Drones, mysterious drones over the Kremlin. Why? What's the point of blowing up a flag, blowing over the Kremlin? Purely psychological warfare, irregular action. The assassination of prominent Putin supporters. So Alexander Dugin, we talked a lot about him when we were talking about Putin's biography. He's a far-right political philosopher. His daughter was following in his footsteps, and she got assassinated. Now, was she the target? No, it was probably him, but he didn't get in the car with her. And here Dugin is. at his daughter's funeral. A crony of Prigozhin. Now remember, Prigozhin got his start in St. Petersburg and met Putin when Putin had returned from East Germany, where he'd been with the KGB. He went back to St. Petersburg and allied himself with one of his law school professors who was starting a democracy oriented party. So that was Putin's job, and that's where he encountered Prigozhin for the first time. Well, in St. Petersburg, one of Prigozhin's sidekicks was assassinated. He was in Prigozhin's hangout bookstore and having a cup of coffee in the back. And a woman went up and handed him a present, a beautifully wrapped statue, but it was booby-trapped. And he opened it and died instantly. Also, an irregular action, hacktivists, Ukrainian hacktivists recently transferred a lot of Russian Bitcoin into Ukraine, where it was either transferred or destroyed. Railways, not just in Russia, but also in Belarus. Railroad tracks in other Russian-held areas of Ukraine, maritime drones. And who knows, maybe the Kakova Dam explosion is part of this. Russian successes, there have been very few, but recently with the counter offensive, there was some Leopard tanks that were destroyed in Zaporizhia, and within days, Shiogin was, and you remember he's the Minister of Defense, was handing out medals. And remember, he's the one that Prigozhin has a beef with, right? He's essentially the defense minister who Prigozhin is making a scapegoat. The Economist says pretending everything is under control in Russia is getting really hard. The Russian propaganda said that the Ukrainian counteroffensive had been thwarted, but it was before it had even begun. Prigozhin himself is criticizing the video of the destruction of those Ukrainian tanks. Also, Shoigu has asked for all these private armies like the Wagner Group to sign a loyalty statement by July 1st. And Prigozhin is not going to do that. So The Economist did a deep dive on him and came up with the nickname the abominable showman. So I think this is going to be where I'm going to stop almost. Let's just look briefly at Putin and Prigozhin in St. Petersburg. They go back a long way. Prigozhin was the chef that entertained George Bush. This, I guess, was the meeting where Bush looked into Putin's eyes and could see his soul, but it might have been loosened by gooseberry marmalade. Prigozhin got his reputation as a chef. Okay, that's where we're going to stop. I've got, I wonder if there's any questions.
Would you comment about, I saw something about China and Saudi Arabia recently.
Yeah, they have brokered a deal and talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Apparently, there'd already been developments, and China was called in relatively late to bless the developments that had already been made and take the heat if anybody opposed it. So China is branching out and trying to get involved. Of course, famously, they're trying to do that now between Russia and Ukraine. But who knows if they can broker some kind of deal. They seem to be too heavily on Russia's side for that to work.
Well, they seem to be interested in becoming a broker, quote unquote. It's like they want to be viewed as the country, the nation that can move these things forward, that they're the new entity as opposed to the United States trying to broker deals.
Yeah, that's their ambition. Okay.
All right.
So we'll resume next week. There's more dissent in Russia among the propagandists. Margarita Simonyan, which some of you will remember when early in the war, she's a real hawk. Putin's the chief propagandist and the head of Russian TV. She's made some interesting statements, and that's my teaser for next time.
Thank you, John.
All
Thank
right.
you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. It was great.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so interesting. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Oh, Homer and Ginny left. I was hoping they would stick around.